Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Creative Contact. I'm your host, Orion, the man who needs a new tagline, still hasn't thought of one, but is coming to you live and direct from my Paris house in the back room. The pod must go on. Now, I haven't heard from me for a little bit. Why? Because your boy been road tripping. I've been with the folks. Maybe I'll throw up some photos right here for you. I'll toss a couple photos up just so you can kind of see where we've been, what we've been up to. But I've been a little bit out of commission. And so I want to talk to you about where I'm at, what we've been up to, what's next, and what's been on my mind. Because I've got a couple fun stories for you, for this podcast. And then now that I'm home, back in action, kind of gearing up for the next step, I want to talk to you just kind of about what's been going on. And as always, make a little life stamp update for my future self. So shout out future Kia. This is where you were at when you're 32. Welcome back from the future. So here's what's up. We went to throw this. If you've been following along with the journey, you know that in March, I went on a Buddhist meditation retreat. This retreat and just my time in India changed my life. But I think to call it a meditation retreat is a little bit misleading because it was actually more of an intensive course around Buddhism. It was 10 days, silent retreat, wasn't much talking. And most of it was actually spent studying Buddhism with a monk more than it was meditating. We did have meditation every day, different blocks, like maybe for an hour or two every day, but it wasn't that much. Most of our time was more spent learning about Buddhism. What does it mean? What is enlightenment? What is karma? Do we have a self? What is I? All these things. And when I was there, I loved to meditate. But after a while, like 2 hours, hour and a half every day, like that's a lot for your boy. And so we'd have this silent time. We'd have to be in there meditating, but I would kind of dip out for meditation and just start to think about things. I would start to write stories or go through different things in my mind, working through things that I wanted to parse through, because meditation takes a certain amount of concentration. And I didn't always have that energy to really be focused in it and in the moment, that present. And I was like, you know what, let me take this time to kind of see where my brain goes and work through some things. And one of those things that happened to crop up was about my dad and both my folks. But at first I started with my dad because my pops is getting a little bit older, and growing up, he always told me about this time he had in the Ozark Mountains. If you don't know my dad, he's pretty much Captain Planet, reincarnate, but without the green hair. And he has this land in the Ozark Mountains that is like way, way out in the mountains, like away from people, not what you're thinking. When you're thinking Ozark Mountains, I think you're thinking of a cabin and it's nice and water's flowing. It's like, we're talking rustic, y'all. We're talking rural. We're talking isolated. Like, my pops' mission was to be as isolated as possible, so out there. But I know this time in his life when he had this land, lived no electricity, no running water, etc., was really influential to him. So I've heard stories for years. That's a family joke, running joke. I'll be like, oh, when my dad starts like back in the Ozarks, you immediately just want to tune out because you've probably heard the story before. Don't tell my dad, but that's what it is. And so I was like, man, I want to go see this place that was super influential to my pops with him. Like every year I try to spend time with dad intentionally. Maybe it's a camping trip or something like that. But as he's gotten older, camping's tough as it is, but it's been especially hard for him because he's getting old. So he just needs a couple more things and to sleep well, etc. And so I had this idea because I know that part of his life was very important. And that land, he still owns this land. And I've never seen it. And I wanted to see it with him. At the same time, that at that point in his life, it was near Fayetteville, Arkansas. And I knew that was where he met my mom. And I was like, this could be a fun opportunity to go back out there and shoot a documentary with both my folks on that period of them falling in love. I was like, I'd love to, maybe we could go back to like where they had their first dance, or the place that they actually first met. Like, what was the house they first met? I knew there was a couple that introduced them. I've never spoken or met this couple. I was like, maybe we could go talk to this couple. I'll interview them. So I have this kind of idea to do this documentary back in March. After I get out of the Buddhist meditation retreat, I call my pop. I'm like, yo, Pop, I got this idea. You think you'd be down to maybe go out to the Ozarks with me? He's like, yeah, let's do it. We eventually are just going to do it, the two of us, because mom is like no, you guys are crazy. You're going to go camping out. It's 3 days to drive because my dad won't fly. So we'd have to drive down. Like, we're going to sleep in the back of his truck. It's going to be this whole thing. Anyways, eventually we get Mom on board, and thank the Lord for Mama Dukes, because we were able to take her car. So we cruised through, and it was just nice having Mom. Like, there was so much context that we would have missed if we didn't have her. So my brother got married 2 weeks ago, I think now. It was this crazy thing. And then we cleaned the house up. We hopped in the car, we packed up, and we headed down for Arkansas, commonly known as Arkansas. So it's like a 2.5 day, 3 day trip down there in the car. And then we ended up staying with the couple that introduced my folks to each other. And I was like, this is going to be rad. I'm going to shoot footage of them. I'm going to shoot footage of the place it went, blah, blah, blah. And staying with them was fantastic. But needless to say, it became pretty clear that people forget some things after 40 years. And because it's important to me, because I wouldn't be here if my folks wouldn't have been introduced, it seems important. It seems relevant to me. But at the time, you don't really know where things are going to go. So a lot of the people that were in my parents' life at that time didn't realize that they were going to be together forever, that they were going to get married, or that they were going to have 2 cool sons, one potentially more handsome than the other, and the other more talented than the other. But people just didn't remember a lot about the time. And so I realized pretty quickly into the documentary that it was going to have to be a different documentary than the one that I had initially expected to shoot. And so I was like, you know what, Kia, screw it. Let's improvise and like just talk to them about what they do remember about my folks. And needless to say, I got some pretty rad footage. Mostly, I got a few interviews, maybe 3 total, 4-ish. But the best part was when I was down there, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, was recently I've been dabbling with AI, and I've been making photos, like realistic photos with AI. And if I remember, I'll put some up here. If not, check my Instagram. You'll see them. And what's crazy is at this point now, I can make better photos with AI than I can. My abilities to create photos with AI have surpassed my abilities to take photos in real life in terms of the overall composition, the results of the photo, the end result of the photo. But the more I thought about it, I think I even mentioned something like this on social, I forget, but somebody said something that really resonated with me. And they were like, Kia, the point of taking the photo isn't the photo itself, right? It's the experience of capturing that moment. And when I think about the AI stuff, I'm like, if the result is what I want, I could do that. But instead, this entire trip taught me, again, if I wanted a great doc, it would have been different than just having this experience with my family. And that's what I ended up getting from it, was the doc. I went into it kind of with this doc idea, but I ended up with just a rad road trip with my folks. And it was a nice reminder, as someone who wants to create out of everything, that sometimes you've got to you can't always impose your will on life, right? And that life will take you where it wants to take you, whether that's what you want to do or not. And so I was like, cool. I was like, all right, let's roll with it. I was like, all right, what if instead of shooting this documentary on how my parents fell in love, what if I just got interviews with people about my folks and instead switched it to the potential for other videos or films down the line? I was like, this is an opportunity to get to know my folks outside of them as my parents, right? I think we often grow up and we imagine our parents just as pieces to our life rather than their own individuals. And the older that I get, the more I realize they're flawed. They don't know everything. They were trying their best. There's more to them than their second son. Not much, but some. And that's what this experience is really powerful for me, was to understand them at a time before me, to understand them as younger people, and then to see how much they've changed, and to recognize them, I think, more as unique entities on their own outside of anything having to do with me. And that in and of itself, I think was really worth it. I do think I'll be able to make some cool stuff with this because I got some they were super sweet and very patient with me because I'd have a microphone in their basement like, hey, what do you think about this? What are you feeling about this? And I know that can get really annoying, but they humored me, and I have some really rad footage now. I'm not the best videographer, cinematographer, or interviewer, but just the raw footage itself of them in front of like a place where my mom worked, where my dad used to hang out at the bar, where my mom was a waitress, and he'd wait for her to get off work. I have some footage of them at the first house they ever met at and had dinner at, and there were a lot of houses we walked by. They're like, oh, we did this here. Random people in the house now, and I would just go up and take photos and take videos of them in front of it. And I don't know what that footage is going to be used for. If nothing else, it was great to have that experience. But I think instead what I'm going to do, the more that I shot, the more footage I shot, the more I thought about it and tried to improvise on the spot, was maybe a documentary about the documentary. Like maybe it'll be a little bit meta, like kind of the documentary that wasn't, and kind of like a documentary or a short film about trying to make the documentary that I think could still be fun. I could still use some of the footage, some of the interviews, and it was super worthwhile, even if right now I don't know what to do with it. And right now that kind of idea for the doc, I wouldn't say was a failure, because we had the experience, but the idea of executing on the doc that I wanted will not be happening because of just the way that things planned out, and I wasn't able to quite get what I wanted out of it. But I do think there'll be some cool things that I'll be able to make from this, and I'm excited about that, just to kind of seeing where it goes. And maybe I'm not ready for it yet. Maybe I have to wait and the idea will come to me, and I'll use the footage for something down the line. But it was pretty much 3 days down, driving to Arkansas with my folks in the car, reading a lot of books. Some crazy book recommendations I have for you, which we can talk about in a little bit. And then staying with the couple that introduced them, which was really sweet, and going down way out into the Ozark Mountains to my pop's property out there. And like, man, what a different way of life like he had. It was out there. And maybe, again, like I said, this was really just kind of to paint in a more full picture of my folks outside of what they've told me. Because I realize a lot of what I know about them, a lot of what I think we understand from our relatives is from what we've gathered and what from they've told us. But it was cool to hear about what my dad was like back then and how much he's changed. And I think there's this idea of stasis that we often get obsessed with, that we feel like we're the same person we're always going to be. The world's going to be the way it always will be. And it's not until, like Toys R Us goes under, that you realize things change, or you look back how much you've changed over the last 10 years and how much you probably will change over the next 10 years. And so it was really cool to be able to get that kind of context from third parties and hear about what my dad was like back then. And then also my mom, we took one day to go down to Oklahoma and go explore her heritage, her roots in Wewoka, this like tiny little Oklahoma town. And when she grew up there, how it was so different than it is now. Like I think that was a really kind of beautiful stark contrast, was using the film, using the idea of filming as an excuse to get my mom to tell me more about these things. So I could film my mom in front of this kind of like rundown house and hear her talk about how it felt so grand as a kid, or how it might have been really nice when she was a kid. And that's such a stark contrast to the visual component of what the house looked like now, and how things kind of can change over time, like people do. Places do have that same sort of a metamorphosis that I just think is interesting to capture, right? My mom had this she worked at this little country bar that's now a Sonic, and so I took some video of them in front of the Sonic, and it was a cool experience to get, even if it was such a different flavor back then 40 years ago, and it sounds like it was, and my mom was like, I don't even recognize this stuff. It was cool to be down there and get their thoughts on it, get a little bit of a visual perspective, even if it's different than it was, and to realize, I think what was one of the most powerful moments was when my dad, there was a guy, the folks that we were staying with, the couple that introduced them, let us stay with them, and they were super sweet. They fed us, they put us up, it was great. And next door to their house in Fayetteville, in Arkansas, was a house that was getting renovated. And there was a guy working there that my dad, 40 years ago, used to teach in a one-room schoolhouse. And a guy there was one of my dad's students from 40 years ago, which was crazy. And it wasn't exactly 40 years ago, I'm just kind of rounding up, but so I think he might have been like 38 or something, so don't quote me on that. But what was crazy, or maybe he wasn't one of my dad's students, but he went, I'm lying, his older sister, because I was like, it was 40, I think he was actually 35. So his sister was my dad's student, but he still went to the one-room schoolhouse, even if my dad had already left it. But, and maybe if I remember, I'll put up some photos here of the one-room schoolhouse. But we went by and saw it and got stories and everything. What was crazy was there's this guy, he looks good, he's like a handsome guy, he's like working on stone, he's like a stonemason. He's right next door, just happens to be. 1 week earlier, 1 week later, we would have missed him. But because of the week we went, he was there. And the couple we were staying with, one day the wife spoke to him and learned that he knew about my dad. I was like, yeah, I went to that one-room schoolhouse. So one day in the afternoon, we go over and talk to him with my dad. My dad's like, yeah, I taught at Headwaters. He's like, oh, I went to Headwaters, the one-room schoolhouse. And what's crazy about this whole thing is my dad used to date his mom. They used to hang out. And we're like kind of the same age for the most part. And I was like, bro, what the difference of one egg, the difference of one cycle, one sperm, and this would have been me. And it was just kind of insane to think about. Like, a lot of times we think about parallel universes like, oh, what if one decision, one thing happened and it would have come over here and been like another thing, and it's easy to like, for us to like think about this and ruminate on it. What would have happened if then, butterfly effect, blah, blah, blah. But what was crazy was to actually see the man that you would have been, to talk to the man you would have been, to shake his hand and say, that seems like a good man. And that man could have been me. That man very possibly would have been me. If one small thing changed in the crazy domino effect of life, I could have been some sort of stone layer, bricklayer, contractor in Fayetteville, Arkansas. But in this universe, things had played out a little differently. But it was just really crazy. He was a super sweet guy, and it's cool. We both kind of acknowledged it, like looking at each other like, whoa, like you could have been me, I could have been you, type of shit. It was just really crazy. We had a laugh over it, actually. And it was pretty, it was pretty cool, but pretty weird, around same age. But my mom, talking to my mom more, I realize now why she really struggled. That was the reason why we left, or why, I'm not saying me like I was around, why my folks left from, that way out in the middle of the mountains, because it was just isolated, and they wanted, it was hard, and my dad was trying to tell stories. There's this whole thing. That's a podcast for another time. But it's just cool to be able to go back there and see what life could have been. And also it helps me really be grateful that I have this life. Not saying that one couldn't have been great, but at least for this version of Kia, this life fits me a little bit better. And yeah, thankful that the dominoes fell the way they did. So just got back last afternoon, 3 days in the car with my folks again. And I guess we'll wrap this up with some book recommendations. So driving down and back, I had a lot of time in the car, obviously. And so there's a author that I stumbled on, and I read all of his books on this trip. I think it was 3 books. And his name's Patrick Kaufman. Shout out Patrick Kaufman. I want to send him a message, actually. I'm going to do that right after I finish this. And he has such a unique way of telling stories. They're like crime thrillers, but they're often told, he just tells stories in a really interesting way. He was also a private investigator. So they're gritty, and the way that he's able to really get into character's psyche is, I think, so beautiful in the way that it feels so real. It's also, it's not that his books aren't like, here's a good guy, here's a bad guy. It's more like, here's the central thing that happened. So in the first one, it's called The White Van. It's like, here's a bank robbery, and then it's from like every character's perspective. It's like the event happens, and then you get to see what was actually going on behind the scenes for like all the characters involved. Super cool. The second one, Every Man a Menace, I highly recommend. Maybe even more. Every Man a Menace is probably my favorite of the three, and then The White Van, and the third one called Clean Hands I liked, but it was just, it felt like it was the weakest link of the three. It was cool though. It didn't really have like chapters. It had 5 chapters total, so it was just like, it was almost felt kind of like stream of consciousness. You were one character and then another, but there was no delineation or paragraph breaks for it. I mean, there were paragraph breaks, but it wasn't like the little dots and then you're a new character or a new chapter. It was just like you're one character and then another. And it was just like this kind of crazy flow of events. And it was cool, but I didn't like it as much as the other two. So Patrick Hoffman, Every Man a Menace, really cool storytelling, powerful, gripping, amazing ways, I think, to define character, and highly recommend. Hold that thought. I will have maybe a small doc about the trip coming soon if I can get on my P's and Q's and pull something together. So more will come. Thanks for tuning in. If anybody who happened to be a part of that trip watches this, thank you for your generosity, for your patience, for letting me probably put a camera in your face and ask you about my folks, and for the love showed to us along the way. It was one of those trips that everything kind of clicked, where, what's Murphy's Law? If something can go wrong, it will. Well, whatever the opposite of that is, was this trip. It was. So many things could have gone wrong. Too much to get into here. But it was like we were just by the seat of our pants, Lorax type shit, just making it work. And it clicked, and I'm glad it happened. Also really glad to be home, back in my routine, shooting content, working on stuff. And I said I was going to tell you what I'm doing next, but I'm going to hold that for the next podcast because I want to dive into that more than I have time for now. Thanks for tuning in as always.